And we're now live on Facebook, Tracy.
Wonderful, Judith, thank you. So good morning, everyone, friends, colleagues and peers who is joining us for this live stream session. I'm delighted today to be sharing our platform with our very own Dr. Sani Aliyu. Today's session will on COVID vaccine myths and what really happened. Will conclude the Reach Network presentations and programme that we brought to you this month celebrating Black History. Before we move on to Dr. Sani's presentation, if I could quickly just take this opportunity to thank all of you who have participated in the programme that we've been running over the month of October. And I want to say a special thanks to the phenomenal team that I've been working with to bring this amazing programme of events to you. So you know who you are, Monica, Judith, Amy. I also would like to express tremendous thanks to our VSM leadership team, to David Werrett, to Mike Moore, to Annesley Donald, and all of the people who've supported us. And a particular thanks to the Adam Brooks Charitable Trust for supporting us financially to deliver the wonderful programme of events that we have for you over October. So, Dr. Sani, I know that you're very busy today and we need to finish promptly at 11 o'clock. But before we do that, I just wanted to take this opportunity to congratulate you actually on your National Award of Honour from Nigeria. Your amazing biographies online for everybody to read and to see at their leisure. But I just wondered before I hand you the platform in your presentation, if you could just share a few words with us about what the award is, why you received it, and what it means to you. So, Dr. Sani, your platform, please share a few moments with us first about the award. Thank you.
Thank you, Tracy. You're very kind. And thank you for inviting me to give this talk. So the award I had took place about 2 weeks ago. It's it's what they call a national honor, really the equivalent of an OBE in Nigeria for services to the country. I was in Nigeria between 2016 to 2019 to help sort out their HIV program. And they had almost 1 million people living with HIV at the time that were at risk of coming off antiretrovirals because of issues with the delivery of the medications and the way the government was running the program at the time. And we were able to do a lot of work around establishing exactly what the burden of disease was, where the patients were, and putting them on treatment, as a result of which at the moment the country for the first time is now heading towards epidemic control based on the UN targets of 1990. The award was also given because of the work we did for about a year on COVID-19 around the time the pandemic came up in 2020. We've been lucky that we've been spared the fatality that we've seen in Europe and other parts of the world. But it was a lot of work, and many people were away from their families, the lockdown, etc. So in a way, it's really appreciation of, I think, our team and the fact that we put in everything to make sure that people were safe in Nigeria. To me, there's no greater honor than really serving one's country, and it's an award that I will continue to cherish for the rest of my career. Thank you.
Well deserved. Thank you so much, Dr. Sani, for sharing that insight, your platform.
Thank you. So the talk I've been asked to give is on the COVID-19 vaccine. I'm just going to share my screen, if that's okay. I hope to be done in the next 40-45 minutes because my computer's going to force me out. So hopefully we should be okay. So my topic really is the facts, myths, and what really happened. And first of all, I just wanted to briefly talk about the three main types of COVID vaccines that are used in the UK in terms of their mode of action. So we have the messenger RNA vaccines, the vaccines that are dependent on a viral vector and protein subunit vaccines. And the key principle here is we have, with the coronaviruses, they have on their surface what we call spike proteins. And these spike proteins are the antigens that stimulate an antibody response. When it comes to the vaccines, it's all about trying to get the body to produce the spike proteins so that in future, if you come across a COVID, SARS-CoV-2 virus, the body will be able to remember and respond to it. And there are three ways of doing this. It's either you inject the genetic material that has the code for the protein into the body, which will be the messenger RNA, or you get some sort of carrier, a virus, to deliver that code into the human cell, or to get the surface protein itself and inject it into the human. So none of these vaccines, all three, none of them contain a live virus, and therefore they cannot cause COVID-19. And neither do they interact with our DNA. The messenger RNA, for instance, does not even enter the nucleus of the cell. And our DNA is within our nucleus, and therefore it's quite far away from any sort of influence when it comes to genetic material, foreign genetic material. So I'll be talking to you about the facts. Why don't we start off with the facts first? And here we'll discuss briefly how the vaccines work, who should have the vaccine, how many people have received the vaccine in the UK, have they been effective, and can they protect against transmission? So first of all, how do the vaccines work? So this is a diagram of the coronavirus. You can see it's a circular sort of virus with spike proteins on its surface. And these spike proteins are the antigens that induce an immune response. The messenger RNA is the strip that can be seen within the circle that contains the code that produces the spike proteins. So with messenger RNA vaccines, what they do is they look at the code, the messenger RNA code, and they synthesize it. And this is then packaged within lipid molecules so that it's protected and then injected into the human body. When it's injected into the human body, the lipid or nanoparticles break up and the free messenger RNA goes into the cell, into the immune cell. And when it goes into the immune cell, it goes into the cytoplasm, works with what we call ribosomes to produce the spike protein, which is then expressed on the surface of the human cell, and it induces an antibody response. So that's how messenger RNA vaccines work. And it's all about the spike protein. The viral vector vaccines, on the other hand, what happens is the actual genetic material, the code, the recipe for the spike protein is put into another virus, an inactivated virus, in this case, the chimpanzee adenovirus. And then the virus is then introduced into the human body. When the virus gets into the human body, it transfers that genetic material into the host cell. So the virus acts like a Trojan horse that delivers the genetic code. And once the genetic code goes into the cell, it then goes into the nucleus to produce the messenger RNA that then comes out of the nucleus into the cytoplasm and induces the production of spike proteins that subsequently then stimulate an antibody response. So at the end of the day, you still have the surface proteins being expressed and inducing an immune response. An example of the viral vector vaccines are the AstraZeneca vaccine and the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. And then the third way they work is, instead of all this genetic code, etc., why don't we just get the spike proteins themselves and just inject them to induce an immune response? And that's exactly how the protein subunits work. They synthesize the spike proteins, they then package them within a matrix together with material that acts as an immune stimulator, and then it's injected into the human body. And once the spike proteins go into the human body, they are antigenic, they induce an antibody response, and you then have antibody production. The immune system, the way it works is once you are repeatedly exposed to the same antigen, it develops a memory. So it remembers, oh, I've seen the surface protein before. In fact, I've produced antibodies against it in the past. So if you get a COVID infection, immediately your body cells will recognize that this is foreign material. We've had experience with this foreign body. Let's just deal with it. And that way you don't develop a severe illness. So in the UK, who gets the COVID vaccine? If you are above the age of 5, ideally, everybody above the age of 5 in the UK should have had at least 2 doses of the COVID vaccine. For those above the age of 16, everybody should have received the booster dose. So that would be the 3rd dose. And for those below the age of 12, but between 5 to 11, if they are immunosuppressed, they should have had a booster dose. And we are now in the autumn booster season, where people above the age of 50, like myself, residents of care homes, people working in health and social care, and also children above the age of 5 within a clinical risk group, immunosuppressed, etc., should have a booster. So if you fall within this group and you haven't had a booster, then you really should have one. And in the UK so far, we've used the Pfizer vaccine, the AstraZeneca vaccine, and the Moderna vaccine. In fact, for the booster doses, AstraZeneca is no longer being used. So we are now using the Pfizer vaccine or the Moderna. And the Moderna vaccine is being used at half the dose of the primary course. And then, of course, we've talked about the autumn 4th dose. And for the autumn booster campaign, the vaccine that's being used, we're using the messenger RNA vaccines, so either the Pfizer or the Moderna vaccine, but they are slightly different in that they are bivalent. In other words, they are not only targeting earlier strains of COVID-19, they are targeting the variants that we currently have. And but children between the ages of 5 to 11 are still receiving the monovalent Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine. And then the protein subunit vaccine, the Novavax, which was the last vaccine to be sort of authorized for use in the UK, is now recommended for those who cannot receive messenger RNA vaccine for whatever reason. So, how has it been in terms of uptake in the UK? At the moment, 90% of those above the age of 12 have received at least 2 doses of the COVID vaccine. And in fact, up to 70% of those within this age group in the UK have had a booster dose. So if you haven't had the primary course of the COVID vaccine, I'm afraid you are in the minority. For the autumn booster dose, just over 8 million people in the UK aged 50 years and over have had the booster dose. And a recent survey showed that, in fact, 80% of adults in England, if approached, will be quite happy to have the autumn booster dose. There continues to be a discrepancy in terms of uptake of vaccines, unfortunately. Within certain ethnic groups. So for instance, if you're Black Caribbean, you're significantly less likely to have received the COVID vaccine. 40% of Black Caribbeans, people in the UK that are above the age of 5 have not been vaccinated. And you are most likely to have received the primary course if you're white British or you belong to an Indian ethnic group. And in fact, if you live in a deprived area, or you are not born in the UK, or English is not your main language, or you're unemployed, disabled, or identify with certain belief groups, you're less likely to have taken the COVID vaccine. And a lot of work is going on around trying to address some of these issues. Are they access issues? Are they issues to do with people believing what they see in social media, etc.? or is there an underlying reason that needs to be addressed? What about in CUH here in Cambridge? So the autumn booster at the moment contains both the flu jab and the booster COVID vaccine. In fact, I had both yesterday. I do have an aching arm, but otherwise I'm still alive and well. And it looks like more people are taking up the flu jab than the booster jab, which is starting to be a bit of a concern. Ideally, we expect the same people to take both vaccines, ideally. And in fact, people within the corporate staff and clerical roles and scientific roles are far more likely to have received the COVID vaccine than in other groups. And we know that the risk is highest in those that have patient-facing roles. But hopefully some progress is being made, and we hope more and more people will take the COVID vaccine up. So the other fact is, how effective are they? Absolutely no doubt. The COVID vaccines work. Absolutely no doubt. You only need to go to our intensive care unit to see the difference between 2020 and now when it comes to COVID. And the main reason has been the widespread application of COVID vaccines. The Pfizer dose in the early part of the pandemic, when the vaccines were introduced, has a 95% protective efficacy. In fact, all the vaccines we use, except the AstraZeneca, have 90% or above efficacy. The AstraZeneca vaccine, overall vaccine efficacy was less at 70%. And even the real world data shows that when it comes to protection against hospitalization, whether it's the AstraZeneca vaccine or the Pfizer vaccine you use, short term, the protection is over 90%. The vaccine continues to be effective even against the new lineages that are emerging. In fact, if you've had the second dose, the primary course 6 months previously, if you take a booster dose now, you are likely to increase your protection against hospitalization by 50 to 60%. And there's very little difference between the performance of the Pfizer vaccine versus the Moderna vaccine when it comes to level of protection. They're fairly similar. But what we do know is that vaccine effectiveness wanes over time. And this isn't surprising because the vaccine induces an antibody response. It's not a cell-mediated response per se. So it's only natural that over time, the vaccine efficacy will wane. In fact, there was this US study of almost 1 million patients presenting with COVID to hospital emergency and urgent care clinics, as well as those that were not vaccinated. And it showed that for those requiring admission to hospital, if you've had a vaccine, it's 89% effective in the first 2 months, but this efficacy wanes to about 66% by the 6th month. And the same applied to those presenting to emergency department or urgent care visits. And the waning of the immune response was evident in all subgroups, regardless of whether you're young or old or immunocompromised. In fact, the immunocompromised group appeared to be even more affected. And the incremental vaccine efficacy waned across all 3 lineages, whether it was the Omicron or the Delta or the Alpha variants. And these findings definitely support recommendations that people should have a booster. How frequently? We're not sure yet, but probably at a minimum, possibly every 6 months. So these are the facts. At the beginning of the vaccine program, there was very good evidence that taking the vaccine protects against transmission. Maybe this was because of the number of people that had COVID and the number of people that were unvaccinated. There were 2 studies done in English and Scottish households that showed a single dose of the vaccine reduced transmission by up to 50% among household members. But when the Delta strain came, the transmission was less pronounced. And for the Omicron period, even though the secondary attack rate continues to be much lower in those that have had boosters, but the transmission is still ongoing, which would explain why we continue to have waves of COVID. But we shouldn't forget that the main reason for giving the vaccine now is actually to protect one from severe illness and to reduce hospitalization and to stop our health system from becoming overwhelmed. There's a lot of work going on into delivery mechanisms, including nasal inhalers that might impact on transmission in the future. So that's the facts. That's real. So what about the myths? There's so many myths going on with regards to COVID vaccine. The accusations that the mRNA technology is new. No, it's not. That researchers rushed the development of the vaccine. It's unsafe in certain groups. It's much better if you get natural immunity than get immunity from a vaccine. That the COVID vaccines are promoting the emergence of new variants, and that the vaccine is very dangerous. It can turn us into zombies. As far as I know, I haven't seen any zombie yet among the 90% of people that have taken the vaccine in the UK. So, but let's tackle some of these issues. So vaccine was approved too quickly. So mRNA technology has actually been around since 1984. Scientists have been working on mRNA since then. There was a drop in the number of studies in the early 2000s because of lack of funding, and because the mRNA vaccine is the mRNA itself is quite fragile. But over time, things have taken off, mostly because of the need to have new treatments for cancers, as well as certain viruses. So for instance, the Ebola vaccine that's currently being used in Africa is an mRNA vaccine. So it's been going on for a while, the research. And the reason why the vaccines were approved fairly quickly was because of the teamwork that went on around the world to get a vaccine for COVID. We knew humankind was in danger. Our economy was suffering. There was a lot of lockdown, and there was we needed we needed light at the end of the tunnel, and having a vaccine was the only way that we could get back to normal, or the new normal. Fortunately, a lot of research has been going on coronaviruses. There was a lot of knowledge about the structure and the antigenicity. Scientists knew that it was the spike protein that was important. There was a lot of teamwork at the time the COVID pandemic emerged. And as we know, with most studies, it's all about numbers, the power to be able to demonstrate whether something is statistically significant or not. And there was no issue when it comes to numbers, because it was a pandemic. There were a lot of people with COVID. So it was fairly easy to demonstrate efficacy within a short period of time. In addition to this, the manufacturers took the risk of manufacturing the virus at the same time as the clinical trials were going on. They didn't wait to say, okay, let's get the license first before we start industrial manufacture. And the review of the studies was done as a rolling review process. In other words, data was analyzed simultaneously as they were submitted. Most of the data from the UK side came between October to December 2020, and scientists all sat around and looked at the quality and the effectiveness. They looked at the clinical trials, quality control issues, and sampling. A lot of work went into this, and there was also a lot of coordination. But what was very clear was that no steps expected of standards of safety and quality were bypassed. And this is an example of how vaccines developed in the past and how the COVID vaccine was developed. So the early stages are all the same. You have the design and exploratory stage and the process development. For traditional vaccines, it takes up to 4 years. For COVID, it was fairly quick, because already a lot of work had been going on around coronaviruses, particularly those causing SARS and the Middle East respiratory virus. When it came to clinical trials, things were compressed. Phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 were going on overlap or simultaneously. And at the same time, there was production of the vaccine. So it really shortened everything, such that within 10 months to a year, we had a COVID vaccine. When you compare this to the mumps vaccine, for instance, it took about 15 years to develop. And there was only one main scientist working on the mumps vaccine, the poor chap. So the other myth is that you're not considered fully vaccinated without a booster. This is more to do with travel. That's not true. The definition of fully vaccinated is really more to do with the primary course. You're still better off having the primary course than not being vaccinated. But the best protection is when you have a booster. That gives you the best protection. But you are fully vaccinated if you have a primary course. Adverse events. So all the boosters lead to short-term local and systemic reactions, but these were very similar to the primary course. In fact, if you tolerated the primary course, you're less likely to have some of the severe adverse events, such as clotting events, with a third dose or a booster. It's been shown repeatedly. However, when it comes to some of the mRNA vaccines, like the Moderna vaccine, for instance, the booster dose that's given is half what was given for the primary course, because it's been shown to reduce the rate of local and systemic reactions. And if you've received the AstraZeneca vaccine for the primary course, we do not give the AstraZeneca vaccine as a booster. What about pregnancy? So pregnant women are significantly at risk of getting COVID-19 if they are not vaccinated, especially in the third trimester, especially if they have underlying medical problems. In fact, if you're pregnant, unvaccinated, you're more likely to be admitted to intensive care and ventilated or placed on ECMO than a pregnant woman of similar reproductive age. We know that the vaccines do not contain live organisms, therefore they cannot cross the placenta and they cannot affect the unborn baby. COVID-19 vaccines, including boosters, are now recommended. In fact, pregnancy has now been put as part of the clinical risk group for people requiring boosters. There's also no impact on breastfeeding. COVID vaccines can be given at any stage of the pregnancy. Here in Cambridge, I think we had something like 10 deaths, I believe, I was told, during the COVID pandemic prior to the vaccines becoming available. COVID-19 vaccines also do not affect fertility. There may be small changes in menstrual cycles. There was this huge study that was done that showed that of about 20,000 women were looked at. The average increase in menstrual cycle after the vaccination was less than a day, but there could be longer duration of menstrual periods and shorter intervals between periods, and bleeding can be heavier than usual. But all these changes are really temporary, and they tend to resolve by the next menstrual cycle. They definitely do not affect fertility. So what actually happened? And now that we've talked about the facts and the myths, let's look at the data. What actually happened? Have people turned into zombies yet? So to do this, we look at the yellow card system. This is a reporting system which involves members of the public, as well as physicians and people within the medical system submitting reports on adverse events. And a lot of these adverse events may not necessarily be related to a drug, but if you have, let's say I take paracetamol and I develop a pretty bad rash, I can submit a yellow card and say, yes, I've had an adverse event. For the COVID vaccines, the majority of the reports related to injection site reactions, just like what I had overnight, having received my COVID jab yesterday. I still have some tenderness and pain around my upper arm. But then it's much better than the COVID I had in April when I was in bed for 5 days. And generally, these happen shortly after vaccination and are usually not serious. They're usually self-limiting. And one thing to remember is that there are absolutely no evidence that if you have the vaccine, you're more likely to have severe COVID-19 illness. For pregnancy, the number of yellow cards have been low. In fact, 180, just over 180,000 women in the UK have had the COVID jab around the time they became pregnant, or around the time or immediately after. That's the first trimester when they are most likely to have, that's when limb formation happens with fetuses. And if you have a drug that has an adverse event on this, it's more likely to lead to congenital anomalies. Absolutely no evidence. There is no pattern to the report for the 180,000 women to suggest that receiving the vaccine led to any of these events in fetuses. And in fact, published studies of more than 15,000 women in USA and Norway showed that miscarriages happened at the same frequency, regardless of whether you're vaccinated or not. Same with breastfeeding. The majority of reports with breastfeeding have to do with flu-like symptoms in children, but then flu-like symptoms in children are very common symptoms in childhood. There have been no serious adverse reports related to breastfeeding. What we do know is that sometimes the amount of breast milk does reduce after vaccination. We're not very clear. It's not very clear why. Maybe because some might have a bit of fever and dehydrated, etc. So breastfeeding mothers are advised to keep themselves hydrated after the vaccine. And even in young people, the monovalent vaccine, we use the monovalent vaccine for young people. We do not use the AstraZeneca vaccine, and the adverse events are approximately half those for those above the age of 18. So at less than 1 per 1,000 in terms of reported events. We have inflammatory reaction that has been described involving the heart layers, myocarditis, we call it, and pericarditis. And this has been linked to the 2 messenger RNA vaccines, but they're very small numbers. They are reported mostly in those under the age of 25 and after a second dose. And most cases are mild and recover with sequelae. It's one of the reasons why the Moderna vaccine is being given at half the dose. What about booster? Are you more likely to have side effects from a booster? Actually not. If you did well with the primary course, the likelihood of you having a serious adverse event with a booster is much, much less. In fact, it's about a fifth. Most were flu-like symptoms, just like you would have, and there were no major safety events. There have been small reports, again, of inflammatory reactions following booster doses with the monovalent vaccines, but so far with the bivalent vaccines, things have been progressing well. Anaphylaxis. Anaphylaxis are severe allergic reactions. So far, about 99 have been reported in association with the Moderna vaccine. It's a potential side effect of the Moderna vaccine because it has some ingredients within the vaccine that can cause allergy and are found in other vaccines as well. So the recommendation is if you have hypersensitivity to any of these ingredients, you shouldn't have the Moderna vaccine. But as I said, when it comes to reports of anaphylaxis, the data shows that the event is about 5 times lower after a booster dose compared to a first dose. So if you've been okay with the primary course, you should be okay with a booster dose. There are other neurological events which include Bell's palsy. This is a temporary weakness or paralysis of one side of the face. Most people recover within a few months. It's very rare. I haven't seen it. Transverse myelitis is also an inflammation of the spinal cord. It's both Bell's palsy and transverse myelitis is associated with certain viral infections such as herpes as well as influenza. But the incidence remains very rare in the UK, less than 1 per 100,000 doses of the vaccine. And most appear to be linked to the AstraZeneca vaccine, which is no longer used in the UK anyway. What people worry about most are the blood clotting events. So if you look at the number of doses given, so almost 25 million people had the first dose of the AstraZeneca and 24 million had the second dose by the end of September this year. The incidence of blood clots was found to be about 16 per million doses with the first dose, and it comes down to about 2 per million doses with the second dose. And so far, 446 cases of major clots has been reported, particularly with the AstraZeneca vaccine. But the risk of death is extremely low. It's 0.0005%. If you have a car accident today in the UK, your risk of death is 1%. The number of people that died from the major thromboembolic events as a result of the vaccination, COVID-19 vaccination, was half those that died in the UK in 2020 from bicycle accidents. It's very rare, and you're less likely to have these clotting issues if you haven't had them with a primary course. So the reassurance here is that the risk is extremely low. And if you have COVID-19, you are much, much more likely to have a blood clot than with the vaccine itself. So it's like being penny wise, pound foolish. You avoid the vaccine because you don't want to have a clot. You end up with COVID-19 and you are far, far more likely to have that clot. So in summary, we've looked at the common myths. So COVID-19 vaccine affects women's fertility? No. Natural immunity, definitely COVID vaccination gives you much better, more robust immunity than natural immunity. And in any case, if you try getting a natural infection, if you're unvaccinated, your risk of death is much, much higher. Researchers have worked on the development of COVID-19 vaccine, and we continue to have a lot of work going on to make them safer. There's a lot of monitoring that's going on. There's no evidence that they cause emergence of new variants. Yes, some of the side effects might be serious, but they are extremely rare. You're more likely to have adverse issues if you get COVID-19 in the absence of a vaccination. And there's a lot of assurance that the mRNA technology, which is not new, that's being used now, is going to change the scope of vaccination globally, and especially from the concept of public health and pandemic preparedness. COVID-19 vaccines do not contain any microchips. You shouldn't be a magnet after you've had the COVID vaccine. If you are, then there must be a reason, another reason. And we just need to remind ourselves that even when it comes to adverse events, these are much less common as we get older. They are much less common with the booster doses than with the primary courses. And if we really want to maintain our protection against COVID, a regular planned targeted boosting is the way to go. Even if you are pregnant, it's the more reason why you should have the autumn vaccination. And when it comes to side effects, the booster doses give similar rates of local, if anything, slightly lower than with the primary course. It's reassuring that that there have been changes as a result of the adverse reporting. So for instance, the AstraZeneca, the steps that were taken to stop the supply, routine use of AstraZeneca were as a result of the yellow card reporting system. The introduction of Novavax was to accommodate those that cannot have mRNA vaccines. The issue of myocarditis, inflammation of the heart muscle, we've seen that rates are much lower if we use a lower dose of the Pfizer vaccine in children, as well as a lower dose of the Moderna vaccine across all age groups. And where variants are emerging with mutations, bivalent vaccines are now being introduced to provide broader coverage, even though they may provide less protection against mild disease, but the protection against severe illness is still very much preserved. So in summary, we know COVID-19 vaccines were developed using science, sound science. Millions of people in the UK have received these vaccines, billions worldwide. They remain very safe. They've undergone rigorous scientific standards for safety, and a very proactive strategy is in place, especially in the UK and parts of the world, to ensure that the benefit of continued use outweighs any possible side effects, and advisories are being regulated and changes are being made as new data emerges. And COVID-19 vaccines, the main reason why we are having them now is not to stop transmission, but it's to stop hospitalization and make sure that our hospitals continue to function. And I'll leave you with this. This is a conversation a coronavirus had with a professor in Columbia University called Robert Pollack. And the coronavirus said, "I cannot believe my good fortune. Our closest relatives have struggled to find a bat or rodent. And here we are thriving in the bodies of human beings. What a gift." When we started off in China, we thought that human beings would all band together, several billion human beings, to find ways to stop us from killing you. But we've made good use of our inherited ability, and it looks like the humans are no longer that worried. So do humans care so little about the ability of coronaviruses to end their lives? And in summary, the coronaviruses are very happy. And when it comes to the happiness of me and my relatives, that's as a coronavirus who make up your pandemic, we cannot thank you enough. Thank you.
Absolutely lovely. That definitely made me chuckle, but really, really thought-provoking and honest and transparent, summary, Dr. Sani. Thank you very, very, very much for that. So important. I wonder if I could just ask you, I know we've only got a couple of minutes because you need to dash off,
Yes.
And while we're waiting to see if there's any comments or questions that come up in the chat, but I wonder if I could ask you, of the three mechanisms of vaccine delivery, just from your own sort of clinical experience, what do you think is the most effective?
So the mRNA vaccines at the moment are turning out to be the most robust, but there is emerging evidence that what we need are whole cell vaccines, because they're the ones that are most likely to accommodate the different variants that are emerging. Otherwise, we'll have to continue tinkering with messenger RNA to accommodate the changes in the spike protein seen in the mutants. So some of the Chinese vaccines, for instance, that were first introduced in China are whole cell vaccines, and there's a lot of funding now going into exploring whole cell vaccines for COVID, which hopefully would mean that there will be fewer, maybe there might be fewer boosters required, but
Yeah.
I am sure there will still be a need for a booster on an annual basis, moving on, looking into the future.
Yeah, and so wholesale, you mean the vaccine has a more broad brush effectiveness in.
Yeah, so the antigenicity is not just based on parts of the spike protein, but it's a much broader antigenicity.
Yeah.
So even if you have different variants, they will still share parts of the protein that is antigenic to humans.
Yeah, okay, that's amazing, thank you. And so just interestingly, for someone like me who had the Oxford AstraZeneca one, and now that isn't available in this country anymore, what sort of advice would you recommend for the booster?
So for the booster, you will have either the Pfizer or the Moderna vaccine. If it's the Moderna vaccine as a booster, you will have half the dose that you would have had if you had taken the primary course. And certainly the side effects for the booster doses are much, much less than with the primary course. You may still have a bit of flu-like reaction and local reactions at the site of injection. But in general, people that have tolerated the primary course at the moment are showing a good tolerance for the subsequent boosters.
Yeah, lovely, thank you. So we've got no questions in the chat, and I'm not going to keep you any longer than we need to, because I know you have clinic at 11. But just obviously one of the things you highlighted, Dr. Sani, was the disproportionate uptake within the BME communities. And I just wondered from your, if you could share some insight about what you think we should be doing, as a workforce, to tackle that as an issue in Addenbrooke's itself, and then in the wider communities, what do you think we should be doing to sort of support people making the right decisions?
So I think it's all about providing people with the knowledge when it comes to safety, and also tackling some of the misconceptions and myths that we see with social media. Unfortunately, the differences in vaccine rates among certain population groups also reflect the issue of access to healthcare. Yes. So it's very much, it cannot be a single approach where we're just tackling COVID issues alone. We also have to tackle some of the issues we know exist within our communities. So access to healthcare, access to good education, access to knowledge, internet, and also working with religious groups, community leaders, people of opinion, to make sure that they are on our side and can provide that information when it comes to allergic events and adverse events related to vaccine. Because it's normal, you'll probably at some point come across somebody who would say, oh, I had the COVID vaccine and I was in hospital for so period of time. Yeah. Because so many people have had the COVID vaccine, millions and millions. So even the rarest of event could still come up. Yes. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't have it. The thing is to balance those risks. And there's no doubt that catching COVID is a major issue for many, especially if you're not vaccinated. When I had COVID, even though I was fully vaccinated, I was actually quite sick. And I thought, gosh, if I hadn't been vaccinated, I probably would have landed on ITU.
Yes.
Yeah. So whatever we can do to get more and more people to accept, especially those that haven't had the primary course, because we know there's still a fair number, 40% within the Black Caribbean community have not been vaccinated, 40%.
Yes.
And that translates to a lot of admissions and a lot of deaths over time.
Yeah. And that there's still a lot of skepticism, but I think this is, I don't know if you saw Ranjit Sangera's presentation about the health inequalities. So this is still a major problem, as you just highlighted again, for disenfranchised communities, communities in remote populations, and, you know, obviously BME communities as well. So I think this is definitely something we, you know, as a trust, we need to think about. So I don't have any more questions, but Monica's just put a comment in the chat. Last year we were grateful, yes, to you, Dr. Sani, obviously, for the work that you did in the DEEC in leading that, and you were instrumental, and we worked together in obviously setting up those sessions and supporting the workforce. And no doubt, I suppose we can have an offline conversation and see perhaps if something like that is needed again, depending on uptake. We're still in early in the season, but, you know, more than happy to work with you, Monica, the EDI team, to promote and do whatever in the Reach network to obviously to support, particularly within our staff and our immediate community, uptake of vaccines. So Dr. Sani, we'll draw a line under the session there. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me, and thank you, Monica, for the comments.
Thank you very much for everything. I wish you a wonderful rest of the day.
Thank you.
This concludes all of our Black History Month presentation. Thank you to everybody who participated. And Dr. Sani, congratulations again on your award. Thank you very
Tracy.
much.
Thank you. Very kind. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye then. Bye-bye.